things happen around us and we don't always have an explanation, right? Hello? You don't always know why. And as a congregational leader, pastor, been doing this for 35 years, and I have people that always are coming to me and saying, why? And sometimes I don't have a definitive answer. All I know that he is still on the throne. Say amen. And if you read the description of his name, he says that he was the one who was and is to come. Do you believe that? Well, if he's the one that was, that's past tense. Is present, and is to come is the future, then I don't think what you're going through caught him by surprise. Hello? I just don't think it caught him by surprise. And so, why do we worry? And why do we fret? Well, it's a natural human tendency to get consumed by what's going on around us. But if you understand that your God is more than enough, say that with me. My God is more than enough. You said it. You really convinced me. I want you to say it again. My God is more than enough. Now, while you're contemplating that, because I'm going to ask you to say it one more time, and I want you to think about the particular situation that you're going through right now that keeps you really almost overwhelmed, that consumes you on a consistent basis. I want you to think about that, and then I want you to ask yourself, is he more than enough? Is he? Is he more than enough? Is he more than enough? Yes, he is. He is more than enough. Wow. I don't know about you, but I get stirred up because I've had the opportunity to watch the hand of the Father in my life, our life, my family. And I've seen it in the lives of a lot of other individuals, and I hear from people all across the nations, and I get to hear the crises. We just heard this morning that one of our Jewish synagogues in New York was attacked by a terrorist, and 8 people were killed. And my goodness, and if you think about that on the Sabbath, you could literally get overwhelmed and depressed, and we're concerned. We want to make sure we lift those people up in prayer, that the Father would support and the compassion of the Holy Spirit would be there. But listen to me, there are times when you're going to have to be willing to do just exactly what Chad alluded to here when Isaac was being laid on the offering. Even if he decides to slay me, I'm going to serve him. What I find is that a lot of us have desperate situations in our lives to where you're kind of grasping for straws. You're the proverbial, life saver, looking for something that you can grasp a hold of to kind of get you out of the morass that you've been going through. But the interesting thing about it is that in spite of what you may be going through, you're not desperate enough, because when you're in the middle of a desperate situation, desperate people make changes. So I want you to do me a favor. I want you to turn to your neighbor and tell him, it hadn't got bad enough for you yet. Look at me now. I'm just telling you the truth. I'm going to kind of gaze around the congregation. I'll be honest with you, it hadn't got bad enough for y'all yet. It just has not gotten bad enough, because when it gets to the point where you're desperate and you're going to storm the gates of hell, isn't that what Yeshua said? The gates of hell shall not prevail. If you look at that, it's not a passive statement. He's literally saying that the walls of hell cannot stop the onslaught of the people of Yahweh. So when's the last time you assaulted the enemy instead of being assaulted? Well, you just don't understand what I'm going through. You don't know how hard it's been. Well, I got news for you. He's the God of more than enough. And you're just not desperate enough for him yet. Desperate people will push through the crowd. Desperate people stop being religious and stop standing on traditions and formalities. Desperate people will touch the hem of a kosher rabbi knowing as soon as you do it, it's a death sentence. Desperate people will leave the comfort zone of the leprous house where you've been isolated from the rest of the community and say, have mercy on me. Hello? And so you're just not desperate enough yet. But there's a day in front of you when desperate times, the temperature is being turned up. Say amen. You can like it or not. You can kind of stick your head in the sand and think that it's going to pass you by. Honey, I got news for you. It's coming like a runaway locomotive, and it's going to segregate the people of Yahweh. Hallelujah. Say amen. We want to look at this week's Torah portion. For those of you that may not be familiar with what a Torah portion is, it's a weekly Bible reading. And we usually look in the Old Testament, and we look in what we call the Law and the Prophets, and we'll compare some of the same things that take place in the New Testament. And the interesting thing about the weekly Torah portions is that they're prophetic symbols. And they're used to teach you about what's happening right now. It never fails. When I read these weekly Torah portions, and the title of this one in Hebrew is Vayera. Say that with me, Vayera. And it means, and he appeared. And it's interesting because Abraham had just circumcised himself. And Abraham was a bad man. Because he was over 90 years old and he circumcised himself. I think at this time he was about 99. And Abraham circumcises himself. Okay? Turn to your neighbor and tell him, that's a bad man. But the interesting thing about it is not only did he circumcise himself, he circumcised his son, who was a teenage boy, and then he circumcises the rest of his household. How many of you would have stayed around long enough for him to come by and circumcise you with a stone knife? Abraham was a bad man. And right in the middle of one of the most impactful circumstances in his life, someone shows up with the ability to change the situation, Vayera, and he appeared. And this Torah portion deals with some pretty significant things. It deals with the expulsion of Ishmael and Hagar, his mom. It deals with the birth of Isaac prophetically. It deals with a number of things that alter the course of Israeli or Hebrew history. But what I wanted to focus on was what's literally taken place as we have an introduction to this Torah portion, and it deals with the circumcision of Abraham, the visitation that he receives. How many of you have read the story before? He's visited by the King James English says 3 angels or 3 men. Well, I got news for you. The King James English is kind of the Reader's Digest condensed version. It does not give you what the Hebrew language says, okay? And then you start looking at the introduction to these 3 visitors that he has, and then an interesting thing takes place. He says, I'm going to reveal something to Abraham regarding my intent to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. How many of you have ever heard of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah? Sodom and Gomorrah is a real place. We've had the privilege of holding fire and brimstone in our hands that came from Sodom and Gomorrah, the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah, by the way. And so it's a real place. And it's used as an illustration in the latter days when Yahweh says, because of the iniquity of the people that's coming in the days in front of us, if he doesn't judge the wickedness in the days that's in front of us, then he's going to have to resurrect Sodom and Gomorrah and apologize to them. Okay? And so it leads me to believe I need to know a little bit of what's going on in this particular Torah portion regarding the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, why Abraham had to be circumcised in the first place. And as we do that, I promise you, you're going to see some things that you've never seen before. And that's a bold statement to make because a lot of you have been studying the Hebrew and you've been looking at the Torah portions for years. But you're going to see some things that you've never seen before. And if you'll hold on, I'm going to try and make it as quick as I can. I've got 9 pages of notes, and it kind of turns around. If you look at it, normally it looks like it may be 3 hours. So I'm going to try to give it to you in a machine gun fashion, maybe close to an hour. If you get tired, feel free to leave. We'll just talk about you afterwards, okay? Because the ones that leave are the ones that definitely needed a visitation. Say this with me, Vayera. And he appeared. The timing of this event, the appearance of the Lord, I believe it was the Messiah himself. I believe it was the manifestation of Yahweh in the earth, and the rabbis will agree that this individual who showed up was none other than the manifest presence of Yahweh himself. We know him as Messiah Yeshua, okay? And it has 2 others in his entourage. It takes place between 2 other really symbolic and powerful events. Number one, 3 days after the covenant of circumcision was instituted with Abraham, Abraham has been sitting underneath the oak at Mamre for 3 days with his head hanging. How many of you would be kind of compassionate to Abraham? I think I would. I was actually circumcised in 2005, I was in my 40s then, and it was in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. No electricity, no air conditioning, no running water, and I developed an infection. And so Abraham and I have a sympathetic relationship, kind of symbiotic. I know why Abraham is sitting underneath this oak with his head hanging, and I know that it's not really the time to be hospitable, okay? I didn't want visitors. I didn't want to be bothered. And here Abraham, he's right in the middle of this visitation, and if you understand what's transpiring here, you know that it has something to do with a specific date on the calendar, okay? As he is given the covenant of circumcision back here in Genesis chapter 18, he then immediately circumcises himself, Ishmael, and his entire house. And if you study this visit is one day prior to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so it's not only the topic of the parsha that's paramount, but you need to understand the purpose of their visit, why they're visiting, and when they visited, because it's very apropos to understanding what's happening at this particular time. And so in order to, for context's sake, we need to establish the date, okay? And if you look at the text in both cases, it's apparent that Abraham would have been circumcised 3 days earlier on the Hebrew calendar. It would have been the 10th of Nisan, the same month that we celebrate Passover, okay? If he's circumcised on the 10th of Nisan, then this visit would have took place on the 14th of Nisan, the day that the Passover lamb would have been executed, the day that the Messiah would have been hanging on an execution stake, and he's visited at the time that was known as the heat of the day. If you read that, it's occurring between noon and sundown, or Bain ha-Arbaim, which means between the evenings of Aviv or Nisan 14 and 15, which would have been the timing for Pesach, Passover, which you know that's when Yeshua, our Messiah, would have been executed on the stake. And then the second visit, when the angels appear later that day at Sodom and Gomorrah, it would have occurred at even, also in Hebrew known as Erev, which would have taken place, according to what most scholars say, and very few disagree here, it would have taken place between the time known as sunset and deep twilight, and it would have begun the festival of unleavened bread. How many are familiar with Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Okay? And all you have to do is to go back, and you can see the emblems of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread demonstrated when Abraham goes and has a calf and unleavened cakes prepared, a lamb and unleavened cakes, and you see the same thing being offered by Lot to the visitors there as well. And it's also interesting that the timing of this visit by the angels, the two that go down into Sodom and Gomorrah, that it would have occurred at the same time that Yeshua's body's being taken down off the execution stake by the individual who's named there as Joseph of Arimathea. How many of you remember Joseph of Arimathea? Now, if you don't study the Hebrew language, his name is kind of insignificant and you don't really know who he is. But that word Arimathea actually comes from a Hebrew phrase, ha-ramah, and he is the one that was responsible for removing Yeshua's body off of the cross. This would have been the same time the visit is occurring with the angels and Abraham in the heat of the day. He had to get it off the cross because at sundown that evening, it begins a high holy day known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, okay? And it's at that time, after the body would have already been off the cross and in the cave, it's at that time that the angels would have been visiting Lot at Sodom and Gomorrah. Do you see that? The word Joseph, by the way, as I said, he's not an insignificant character. His name, Yosef, Joseph, means Yahweh will add, Yahweh will do, and he will do it henceforth. In other words, he's not going to beat around the bush. If he says he will do it, he will do it. He's not a man that he should lie, neither the son of man that he should repent. If Yahweh said it, he'll do it. How many of you have been in a difficult situation and you've had a promise from Yahweh, but you don't know if he's going to do it or not? Well, he's not a liar. He's going to do it. He'll do it again, and he's going to do it henceforth. It's just that he has a different way of keeping time than what you do. Does that make sense? Arimathea, Joseph of Arimathea, it comes from the root word Ramah. Ha means thee, and Ramah means lofty, height, to lift something up. But it can also mean or indicate to bring decay and see destruction. Isn't that amazing? If you look at the name of the man who takes Yeshua's body and puts it in a cave and gets him ready for burial, his name literally means Yahweh wills. Henceforth, at this time, expediently, Yahweh is going to lift up Yeshua above decay, above death, and above destruction. Does that make sense to you? You know that he's just been killed. And so Yahweh prophetically has a man to act this role out, and he comes and he's making a declaration, and he says, I am going to lift my son up above death and decay and destruction. Isn't that what he said? I will not suffer my Holy One to see corruption. But yet our mind kind of staggers because he's dead. The flesh is dead. But he didn't see corruption. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. So, again, the timing here of this event is crucial. And it's apparent to me that a cutting off has to occur prior to destruction. Abraham is circumcised. Something's cut off. Hello? And I'm not trying to be funny here. But there's a cutting off that takes place before destruction. And you see that these angels go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and guess what? Somebody has to be cut off or taken out of Sodom and Gomorrah prior to destruction. You see Yeshua being on the execution stake. He's cut off from the earth. He's cut off from among the quote-unquote living, and then what happens? Destruction. Do you see a pattern developing here? And you can see it in Ephesians chapter 4 because it tells us that our Messiah led captivity captive. In other words, you see, as soon as Yeshua goes into the grave, he's not a dead man. That's what makes the God you serve different from Allah or Buddha or Hare Krishna or any other quote-unquote entity that's worshipped. Our God is alive. And let me share this with you. He is the God of the living and not of the dead. And you'll see that clearly in a few moments. So what I want you to grasp here is that what Yeshua does is that he also leads someone out to keep them from suffering destruction. He leads those that had died prior to him out of hell to keep them from seeing destruction. Just like Lot and his family are led out of Sodom and Gomorrah to see them not suffer destruction. You see Moshe leading the children of Israel out of Egypt so that they don't suffer destruction. You see Noah going into the ark. His family are taken up out of the world so that they don't see destruction. Do you see a pattern here? Do you think that maybe this is a pattern telling you that destruction and devastation is coming your way in the days ahead of you, but Yahweh will circumvent you, circumcise you out of that? It doesn't mean that there's a rapture taking place, because if you study the patterns, it's always the evil ones that were raptured out. You're the ones that are going to stay here and rule and reign with the king. Does that make sense to you? You sure? So it leads me to believe that there was something about these holy convocations long before you see them written down there in Exodus chapter 12. And the pattern continues. How many of you remember when Yahweh visits Abraham and tells him to leave the land of his forefathers? And he leaves the land known as Ur of the Chaldees, right? If you go back and study it, you can see that clearly from Exodus chapter 12, verses 40 and 41, that 430 years from the day that Israel left Egypt, which would have taken place at the same time the angels were visiting Abraham, you see, Abraham would have also exited Ur of the Chaldees at the very same time. Nisan 15, he made an exodus just as Yahweh foretold with the children of Israel. And many of us believe that there's going to be a greater exodus in the day ahead of us. You believe that? Is this hard to understand thus far? If you're having trouble, we'll go back. You getting it? It would seem then that the angels, after the visitation there with Abraham, the angels then go down to Sodom and Gomorrah and they have a visit in a conference with Lot. And if you read it, you can see that Lot, his wife, and 2 daughters make their exodus from Sodom at the morning or dawning of the 15th of Nisan, the very time Abraham would have left Ur generations ago. Moshe and the children of Israel leave Exodus. Yeshua is executed, buried in the grave, and he leads captivity captive. It would have all occurred basically about the same time. And so once more, you see that there has to be a cutting off of circumcision prior to destruction, which follows, guess what? The first time you see it is in Genesis chapter 3. You see Adam and Eve, they sin, and they have to be cut off from the garden. And because of their fleshly sin, there has to be a lamb cut off. A lamb is circumcised from the living. Does that make sense? So that Adam and Eve not suffer destruction. Are you beginning to see this pattern? Come on. So I have to ask a question, and this is what I was doing as I was looking at it. Why did Yahweh decide that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? And there were actually 3 other cities. You can see it in Deuteronomy 29:23, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboam. They're all listed as having been destroyed by fire and brimstone. Why? Well, initially, you think it was because they were sinful, right? Well, if that's the case, you're going to see some of the very same sin that Sodom and Gomorrah is guilty of that takes place in this parsha. Because if the people, the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, are destroyed because of incest and or adultery, guess what? Incest takes place in this Torah portion between Lot and Lot's 2 daughters. So why didn't Yahweh cut Lot off or leave Lot to be destroyed in Sodom? See, that's why you need to ask questions. Turn to your neighbor and tell them, inquiring minds want to know. So there has to be an underlying reason for these principal cities to be slated for destruction. And I went back and I looked at the first occurrence of Sodom and Gomorrah, and you see that they're part of the land that was entitled, if you will, to Canaan, one of the sons, or the grandson, if you will, of Noah. And if you look at it in Genesis 10:19, they're listed there as the border cities of this place known as Canaan. And how many of you know that that's where the children of Israel were told they were to go in and take possession? It's a promised land. Why do you think Yahweh wanted the children of Israel to go into this specific location? It was evidently pretty important to him because you see Abraham right here at the threshold. He's at the doorway. And Abraham's going in. In fact, Abraham at present is already in the land of Canaan, and he's got to go in and displace some of those inhabitants. And you see the children of Israel doing that later. Am I right? Canaan is named after the youngest son of Ham, who was cursed by Noah. How many of you remember Genesis chapter 9, when Ham comes in and sees his father's nakedness and he gets cursed? Actually, Ham doesn't get cursed. It's his son, who's not listed as ever having been born at this particular time. It's the grandson that gets cursed. And if you remember, Ham commits sexual perversion here with Noah, his father, and with his wife. And there's a lot of people that would argue with you there and say, well, he just went in and looked at the nakedness of his father. But if you understand the euphemistic terms used there in the Hebrew language, what he did, he goes in, his father's drunken, and his father and his mother are in their private dwelling. They're in their bedroom. Ham goes in, and he has his way not only with his mother, but with his father. It's my opinion that both incest and sodomy occurs here at this particular location. Sodomy? Sodom? The Sodomites? So you have to ask your question, is there a connection? And we're not trying to berate any particular sin or make any particular sin more grievous than others. I'm just trying to explain to you what the Hebrew language says. And so we have to ask ourselves, why was Canaan cursed and not Ham? Canaan is not the one that did the sin there. His father did. And so you have to ask yourself, what was Canaan created from? Where was he acquired from? Because that's what his name means. It means to acquire, to be fabricated. It indicates one who's created for a specific purpose, and his cursing would be instrumental in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's a pretty powerful legacy to leave behind you. Think about it. You have a grandson who's cursed. Someone pronounces a curse on your grandson, and then that grandson, the curse on him causes 4 principal cities, and the scholars say that these 4 cities were compared to a metropolis today, something like Minneapolis and St. Paul, sister cities with hundreds of thousands of people in them. His actions caused these people to be cursed. And so once more, it had to be far more than just the incest and adultery that occurred there with his father in Genesis chapter 9. Something else is going on behind the scenes. Does that make sense? Are y'all with me? And so let's look at that word Canaan or Canaan. It comes from the root kana, which means to be subdued, to be brought down, or to be brought under. And so it leads you to believe that the offspring of Canaan would be created and placed in an area or a position that would require them to be subjugated. In other words, if Yahweh's telling you that all your children are going to be subjugated, it means they're going to be brought under bondage and under slavery, right? And so that means that they're created for, if that curse is that powerful, it means that they're going to be birthed for the express purpose of being subjugated. Genesis chapter 9 says that Canaan would be a slave both to his brother Shem and Japheth. They would be subjugated. And when I read that, I thought, wow, in Genesis chapter 1:28, Yahweh tells Adam to be fruitful and multiply and replenish, and then he says subdue and have dominion. You remember reading that? Again, there's a connection here. So why would Yahweh tell Adam that something outside Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, would require him to forcibly subjugate it if there was not an entity outside the garden, or maybe that crept in the garden, that wasn't his enemy? Can you see that? And so you see that Canaan also has this same curse on him as whoever Adam is told he's going to have to subjugate. So there's a connection to Canaan and the enemies of Yahweh there outside the garden that Adam said, hey, is told, you're going to have to bring them under control. You're going to have to subjugate them. Does that make sense? Does it? I thought it was kind of interesting because I went back and looked at some of the lineage of Canaan, and he had a son whose name was Zidon or Zidon. How many of you remember Nimrod? Remember it said of Nimrod that he was a mighty hunter before Yahweh? And Nimrod's the one that built the Tower of Babel. Did you know that the same Hebrew words used to describe Nimrod as it was the son of Canaan, Zidon? Have you ever just looked at it? It's the word Zud. Say that with me, Zud. And it means one who hunted men to consume. He was a cannibal. How many of you remember Numbers chapter 13 when the spies came back and said that the land devours its people? Scholars agree that there were evidently cannibalistic nations inside the Canaanite nations, which is some of the ones that Abraham and Lot are now having to deal with. So it could be that that's also part and parcel of the reason that Yahweh saw fit to bring destruction on them. Does that make sense? Even, did you know that there are a lot of civilizations, the peoples of several different civilizations, that actually believe that if you were to cannibalize your enemy or even kill an animal, that if you would take and eat part of that animal, especially if raw, immediately after you had killed it, that you would take on the soul or the spirit of the animal? Have any of you ever read that? And so the mindset behind cannibalism was more than just consuming it for the flesh. It was because they felt as if by consuming it, they took on the soul or the spirit of whomever they had consumed. Does that make sense? I want you to remember that. And so when Yahweh tells Adam, there's something here that you're going to have to subdue, that means that there's something outside the confines of Eden, that is an enemy of Yahweh. And how many of you remember the story? Adam loses a battle with his flesh, right? And so as long as Adam's in the flesh, Adam is not capable of subduing Yahweh's enemies, much less his own. Oh, hold up a second. Maybe I need to repeat that. As long as I'm in the flesh, I'm not capable of subduing Yahweh's enemies, much less my own. So what happens to Adam? Adam has to be redeemed. But Adam is not a capable sacrifice. Adam cannot redeem himself. And so Adam, for all intents and purposes, is a dead man. He has to be circumcised from the earth. Does that make sense? And so he has to be cut off or see destruction. And since he can't redeem himself, Yahweh comes in Genesis chapter 3 and slaughters the lamb. It's the lamb that gets circumcised from off the earth so that Adam can be redeemed. And so there you have the first look at the covenant of circumcision. It was more than just circumcising the male anatomy. It has to do with cutting off the flesh. Listen to me. If the flesh doesn't get cut off, you cannot subjugate the enemies of Yahweh. If you are a fleshly, carnally driven individual, you cannot subjugate the enemies of Yahweh, and you can't subjugate your own. That's the reason that the quote-unquote body believers today sees little to no miraculous things happening. It's because we're carnal-led individuals. We indulge in the fleshly appetites. We're not walking in the Spirit, and therefore we can't subjugate or bring our own enemies under control, much less the enemies of Yahweh. Say amen or oh me, it's still the truth. So why would Yahweh institute a covenant of circumcision? It's so important that Abraham was called the father of faith. And if the father of faith is required to be circumcised, I would submit to you that we need to be circumcised as well. Okay? And there's a prevailing argument, especially in the Hebrew roots movement and even in the Christian community. Our brothers think, well, we're not really sure if you need to be circumcised in the flesh. And there's an argument. I saw a bumper sticker here a few months ago on a van in Salem, and it actually said that circumcision was unlawful and a sin because it was mutilating the flesh. And I thought, wow. They do not understand what's being required here. It's not so much circumcising the physical anatomy as it is circumcising the heart. Did you know that Yahweh requires you to be circumcised in 3 areas? First, you're circumcised in the heart. And guess what? If you're circumcised in your heart, you'll circumcise the foreskin of your lips. That's what it says. Circumcise your mouth. Why? Because out of the abundance of the heart, your mouth is going to speak. And so whatever comes out of your mouth determines whether or not you've been circumcised in the heart. And so the natural thing for me to do is to follow that commandment by being circumcised in the flesh. In other words, I do everything I can to bring my flesh under control. It's far more than just circumcising the male anatomy. It's by getting my fleshly carnal appetite under control so that I'm led by the Spirit, not by the flesh. Am I right? And I'm going to show you why. You were originally created as a being of light. Go back and read Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. Yahweh is light. Yahweh says, let there be light. And light was. And if you read chapter 1 of Genesis in verse 14, it's not until verse 14 that he creates the light luminaries in the heavens. And so there's literally light in the earth before the sun, moon, and stars are created, right? And so if Yahweh is light and he speaks things into creation by his word is light. And so Yahweh has the ability to create by releasing his word or releasing light. And everything else will reproduce according to the law of Genesis. Everything reproduces after its kind. And so if Yahweh speaks Adam and Eve Adam into existence by his word, Adam and Eve are created by light. They are light beings. I don't know if I believe that. God is light, and you are children of the light. Walk ye in it. New Testament. And so if you're supposed to be children of the light, it literally means you are supposed to be a light being. Am I right? Huh? And so Adam would reproduce just like his father. Adam had the ability to speak things into creation. I'm convinced that Adam and Eve could have had offspring in the earth without ever having a physical conjugal relationship simply by speaking just like Yahweh did. I don't know if I believe that. How many of you believe in Yeshua's Messiah? How many of you believe in the virgin birth? She didn't have a man, did she? Well, how did Yeshua get here? She was overshadowed by the light. The light was released in the earth. He was the light of the world. Do you see why we need to go back and see what the language teaches us. And so Adam had the ability to reproduce by speaking, just as Yeshua was created. But after the fall, because of the corruption of the flesh, the light was hidden in a fleshly skin. Say that with me, skin. And it's interesting because the original light in Adam's body becomes congealed and it forms what we know today as blood, but yet it still has some of the DNA of the Creator, but it also now has some of the DNA of fallen man in it. See what I'm saying? It's the DNA of the fallen man that has to be redeemed. Let me just share this with me. How many of you know how to say covenant of circumcision in Hebrew? What is it? Brit milah. The word Brit means what? Covenant. What does milah mean? It means to cut off, it means circumcision, but do you know it comes from a Hebrew word that also means to speak? And so when you understand the covenant of circumcision, once you have the flesh under control, you cut your flesh off, you have the ability to speak the word of Yahweh. You now have just joined yourself to the covenant of speaking Yahweh's word. Does that make sense? Once you have your heart circumcised, your flesh will follow suit. And guess what? What comes out of your mouth should be an indicator that you have a covenant of circumcision because you have rejoined the covenant of speaking just like Adam did. You now have the ability, if you're walking in the Spirit and not after the flesh, you should have the ability to be able to demonstrate the covenant of light, word, speaking, creation. That's what you're supposed to be doing. And yet we think that it has everything to do with just circumcising the male anatomy, the foreskin of the male anatomy. The word for foreskin there is orlah. The word for uncircumcised is orel. The word for naked is arom. And they all come from the same ayin resh root. And guess what? It means enemy. And so when you're circumcised in the flesh, you're cutting off that enemy that Yahweh said had to be subjugated. Now you know what Yahweh is speaking to Adam and says, be fruitful and multiply, subdue and have dominion. You're supposed to subjugate everything that doesn't have the DNA of Yahweh in it. You're supposed to subjugate the flesh, which is the enemy of Yahweh. Does that make sense? What about the word for circumcise in Hebrew? It's the word mul. Say that with me. Not mule. Sometimes my southern drawl gets, those vowels messed up. It's mul. And its root stem it's the mem lamed, comes from a word mulad, which means to birth something, to cause it to have its origin. And the new moon is referred to that, the mulad. However, it hints at words or speech, that which is spoken. And so circumcision of the heart, your lips, your flesh restores the ability to speak light and to create. And thus it gives you the ability to destroy death. Death has to be subdued in every form it's found. Sin, sickness, and disease. Did you hear me? So now you know why it was imperative for Abraham, the father of the faith, to be circumcised. And by the way, if you read 1 Corinthians 15:50, if you think that you're going to make it into the kingdom and you're going to be a carnal-led, fleshly-driven individual, it says flesh and blood cannot, in other words, death, cannot inherit the kingdom of Yahweh. Isn't that interesting? And by the way, how many of you remember that Abraham was told to leave Ur of the Chaldees? Ur is a compromise, an etymological relative to the word light. And the word Chaldees there literally can indicate sorcery and magic, magicians, those that are given towards the release of distorted words. And so wouldn't that be right for Abraham to leave that place where he was charged with speaking distorted, confusing, magical incantations that would corrupt the seed or word of Yahweh? Isn't that what the serpent did? So now you're understanding why there's an encounter taking place here at Passover. You understand now really the purpose of Passover, because Passover is to redeem you from death unto life. Passover is a season when you're to be circumcised in the flesh, and because you can't redeem yourself, Miss Jean quoted it earlier in Romans chapter 12, where it says, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind, that you may present yourselves living sacrifices, holy and acceptable unto Yahweh, which is your reasonable service. The least that you can do in the kingdom is to lay down and die in the flesh. If a man will lose his life, he gains it. Isn't that confusing? If you were following Yeshua and he's making these statements, you'd think, well, he's telling us to commit suicide. And because we don't have a fundamental understanding of the redemption plan from Yahweh from the beginning, it's not talking about destroying yourselves or someone else or committing suicide or just getting out of this life. It's about living for him by subjugating my fleshly man. And it's as simple and plain as that. If we will learn how to bring our flesh under control, we will become the vessels that Yahweh can use to change creation. And I believe if you read in Hebrews where he says that our Messiah is standing at the right hand of the Father, it says that he's doing something there. How many of you know what Yeshua is doing at the right hand of the Father? It says that he's waiting until his enemies are made his footstool. Well, wait a second. Who's going to bring his enemies under his feet if he's there waiting? I'm just asking you a simple question. Well, I'm not really sure now. You've kind of put the spotlight on. I'm not really sure. I just told you who. Those that have been commissioned by Yahweh to be fruitful and multiply and replenish, to subdue and have dominion, are those that will circumcise their flesh and then enjoin themselves in the covenant of words, the covenant of circumcision, so that you can begin to speak into creation. In fact, Romans chapter 8 says that as many as are led by the Spirit of Yah, these are the sons of God. And then it goes on to say that creation itself is waiting for the sons of God to stand up and be recognized. For what purpose? So that you could set creation free. That's your job. That's your job. I want to say it again. That's your job. You're to set creation free. Every time that you encounter death in the earth, sin in the earth, sickness in the earth, you have a moral, spiritual responsibility given by Yahweh to subdue the enemies of Yahweh, and sickness, death, and disease, strife, confusion, all that other junk that's contrary to the word of Yah is an enemy of Yahweh. And first of all, if it's in here, you need to deal with it before you try and address it in someone else. And there's the conundrum. Is that making sense? Let's look at the word subdue so that you'll see where I'm going here. Yahweh tells them to subdue their enemies, and it does mean to subject someone, to subdue it. But all you have to do is to change the vowel points. It's kaf, bet, sheen. You change the vowel points and it becomes kavesh, which means a lamb, a male lamb suitable for sacrifice. Do you see that? How are you going to subdue your enemies? Because you're going to take and apply the blood of the lamb, just like Adam did in Genesis chapter 3. Because the blood of the lamb is what covers this dead flesh and redeems the dead flesh. I can't redeem the dead flesh. And so all I can do is become an observer of the covenant by taking what he's provided for me and covering myself with the blood of the lamb. Does that make sense? Anything outside of that, the fleshly man is frail and can't stand. And by the way, if you look at the numeric value of kavesh, the word for subdue or the word for the male lamb, it's 322. And it's the same gematria or numeric value as the mountain where Moshe was buried, Abarim, which interestingly is cognate with the word Hebrews and the word Abraham, Ivrim, Ivraham. And so it seems to me then that one of those charged with subduing the enemies of Yahweh is Abraham and everyone that would be called a Hebrew. Abraham was first called a Hebrew. And if you call yourself an Ivrim, one that's crossed over, then you're responsible for subduing the enemies of Yahweh. It's hard, isn't it? It's hard. It doesn't say this in the King James English. It says it in the Hebrew. And so if you go back and look at our first illustration of the covenant of circumcision, and we're going to get back to Abraham. I'm just trying to establish a foundation and a precedent here. You see why Abraham was circumcised. Adam became circumcised in the flesh, and he was able to overcome by the blood of the Lamb, and he became one who had crossed over. Adam became the first Ephraim or Abraham. Adam became the first father of nations. Did you hear what I just said? Abraham was called the father of nations. And the reason that he's the father of nations is because he has just had restored to him. The first thing Adam realized after he and Eve had sinned, he says, I'm naked. Why? Because the light garment was gone. There was no more the ability to speak light and change creation. But because of the blood of the Lamb, he realizes, I've been redeemed, I've been restored, and now I have the ability to speak into creation again. Can't you imagine what a joyous occasion it would have been? And the interesting thing about it is that Abraham's predicament at that particular time, in my opinion, was even better than it was in Eden. How can you say that? Well, in Eden, there was nothing there to challenge him, right? Except for the serpent. But after the fall, outside of Eden, he had an extraordinary more of an opportunity to demonstrate the word of Yahweh in a cursed situation. Do you see that? What more powerful way to demonstrate the majesty and power of the king than to be able to stand up in an ideal situation when everything's going great, there's nothing going wrong, nothing could be better, tiptoeing through the tulips, everything's all right, I'm just having a grand old time and I'm just going to speak the word of it. Well, nothing's going on. But what if I'm being harassed and hounded by the foxes and the hounds are baying at my heel and the enemy's doing everything he can to destroy me? What better opportunity than that to speak the word of Yahweh into that corrupt, cursed situation and see it change? Abraham understood that, and I'm convinced that Adam did. Amen. Now, let's fast forward again back to Abraham, because I'm going to show you why they chose Abraham to visit. Can I be honest with you? Yahweh just, I want everybody to look at me. I'm going to try and sweep across so I can catch everybody's eyes if I can. Yahweh just doesn't pick individuals arbitrarily or by accident. He's an astute. If Yahweh was a bank robber, he would never rob an empty bank. He only would rob something that had deposits made in it, okay? And if he's an individual that is going to pick someone to use, and he's going to be a student of that individual's habits and patterns. And so he looks at Abraham and he understands that Abraham had been given the land of Canaan by inheritance. Now remember that. And so it leads me to believe if there was a land here that belonged to Abraham by inheritance, that Yahweh must have had enough confidence in Abraham that he'd be able to go in there and subdue it and have dominion in it. How many of you have been given charge over something in your life? I want to just ask you a question. How many of you have had some difficult situations within the last year in your life? You realize he made you a promise that he would not put on you anything more than what you're able to bear. And so if you're going through something right now that may seem difficult, it may seem as if it's a hazard to your life, if it's uncomfortable, Yahweh's allowing you to go through it because you're an Abraham, and it's an opportunity for you to demonstrate the faith of Yahweh in the middle of that and make the declaration of Yahweh that as for me and my house, we're going to circumcise you. And you're going to walk upright before him. If you want to be a part of the house of Abraham, get ready to be circumcised. Hello? Get a close-up of that. If you want to be I've seen that. If you want to be part of the house of Abraham, you better be willing to circumcise yourself. See, it's laughable. But this is the conundrum that we find ourselves in the community that calls ourselves believers, because we walk according to the flesh, not after the Spirit. If we were walking after the Spirit, then all of this stuff, sure, by times you can get shaken. I understand that. I'm not perfect either, but I also know that Yahweh's delivered me in every time and every situation. He has never failed. And if he did it one time, he'll do it again. So if Abraham has Canaan as part of his inheritance, it indicates that it must have been a previous possession in the lineage of Abraham's ancestors, right? Go back and read Genesis 1:28. You'll see the title deed is given to the land of Canaan right there to Adam and all of Adam's posterity. And let me remind you something. The title deed, look at me. You have an inheritance that's been promised you by Yahweh. But that inheritance belongs to the living and not the dead. If you're walking according to the flesh, you're a dead man and you can't access your inheritance. Uh-oh. I don't know if I believe that. Abraham had to cross over from death unto life. Matthew 22 and Exodus chapter 3 says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzhak, and the God of Yaakov, Isaac, and Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Go back and read that. In Matthew chapter 22 and in Exodus chapter 3, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were dead. Naturally, Yahweh must be a doddering old fool and has forgotten that they died off, because he says that I'm the God of the living, not the dead. Those were dead men according to the flesh, right? But he says, I'm the God of the living, and he specifically names Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I got news, your name could be penciled in right there, because if you walk according to the Spirit, you're a living man, not a dead man. And go back and finish looking at the progression of Abraham's life. In Genesis chapter 15, you see the first time that Yahweh starts talking about this inheritance thing. And there's a sacrifice that's offered. And there's a price that's assessed to gaining that. You don't listen to me. Look at me carefully. You ain't going to get nothing from Yahweh without a price tag on it. Well, what about mercy? I'm glad you asked. Ephesians 2:8 and 9. For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. That's the New Testament, and sometimes the New Testament forgets where mercy, chesed, is first mentioned. Sometimes it forgets where obedience, chen, is first mentioned. Obedience means you're rewarded by being faithful. Hello? I just wanted to make sure. If you get something from Yahweh, it's because you've been faithful. If you're faithful in the little things, I will reward you with bigger things. Say amen. Now back in Genesis chapter 15, Abraham offers a sacrifice. And the interesting thing is that Abraham, because he's a fleshly man, Abraham's not able to walk between the pieces of that covenant, because ancient Near Eastern treaty language required if you enter into a covenant with an individual, you have to be able to be at least on an equal standing of the one that's cutting a covenant with you. And they would literally cut the animals in pieces, and they would walk in between them, each one affirming that the terms of the covenant would be ratified by the life of the individual who's covenanting together, right? Abraham can't covenant with Yahweh because he's a fleshly man. Abraham's put to sleep. And Abraham has this vision, and he sees a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that's able to walk through the pieces. Remember that? And so the covenant wasn't ratified by Abraham. Abraham's just an observer of the covenant. Can I ask you a question? Are you an observer of the covenant? Do you look at it? Do you keep it? Do you regard it? Are you honoring the covenant? So you can't cut the covenant with Yahweh, because it's a covenant between the two individuals on equal footing, Yeshua and Yahweh. However, if you are willing, you can become an observer of the covenant, agreeing to apply the blood of the Lamb to your life and sacrifice the fleshly man. Now I'm an observer of the covenant, and I can take part of it, and I can have the benefits of the covenant. I cannot guarantee it. Does that make sense? Abraham is an observer. The one that's walking through the pieces is the living ancestor, the one that was actually entitled to the inheritance. He was the one who was, is, and is to come. That's who shows up when Abraham's about to have to confront Sodom and Gomorrah. Let me just share this with you. Abraham knew what was going on over in Sodom and Gomorrah. That was in his backyard. It was just a short day's walk, about a half a day walk. And either Abraham's going to have to go in there and deal with Sodom and Gomorrah, and subdue it, bring it under subjection. Abraham took 300 men and went to the slaughter of the kings on one occasion. He probably could have done it, 318 men. Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim was a different animal. And because Abraham became an observer of their covenant, he brought somebody else stepped in and was capable of taking care of business. The same one that was able to walk through the pieces showed up at this particular instance, and we'll look at it. That word for lamp there in Genesis 15 is the word lapid. Say it, lapid. It's from the root stem paid dalet, which means to ransom or to redeem. The lamed indicates to, toward, while that paid yod dalet means disaster or judgment. In other words, the lamp is the one that urged them towards the Torah in order to redeem them from disaster and judgment. This is the original landowner that just walked between the pieces. Do you see it? And he's the original landowner that's just showed up in Abraham's back door after Abraham circumcised himself. I can imagine Abraham probably had enough backbone if Yahweh had said, I want you to go down into Sodom and Gomorrah and see what's going on there and deal with them. Abraham probably would have done it. The numeric value of lapid is the same as the priestly name Adnah. And it's interesting because that word Adnah comes from the same root as the word Eden. The lamp that was in Eden, the one that was in the Garden of Delight, the head, the husband, the strong one from Eden is the one that showed up there where Abraham was sitting circumcised. And I can imagine when he walked up, he was a pretty imposing individual because he got Abraham's attention in the middle of Abraham's discomfort, in the middle of Abraham's pain. And I can imagine he was probably not the most popular man. If you go back and study, even medically, they tell you that the third day of the circumcision, especially if you're advanced in age, the third day is the difficult day. And Abraham probably wasn't very popular in the house at that particular moment. I don't think the ladies would have liked him, and I don't think the men liked him. And so the minute that you're the most isolated, the minute that you're the most uncomfortable, the minute that you're feeling the most pain, the minute when you don't feel like doing what Yahweh wants you to do, someone imposing and impressive will show up just to challenge you to get up and do something better. And what are you going to do? Excuse me, Lord. But I've been circumcised here. I mean, you can kind of relate to this. You created me, and I'm kind of in pain. You think we could reschedule this? You know, it's really uncomfortable. Lot's over there in the other place, and he might not be as good as I am, but he's on duty this week. When's the last time your circumstances challenged you to get up and do something better? To do something a little more? Are y'all with me? Can y'all hold on for me? I'm just halfway through. Can y'all hold on a little bit longer? And I find it interesting because we're talking about Lot and Abraham. And Brittany did an excellent job last week because she was talking about Lot. And the word lot in Hebrew literally means a garment, a covering. And so Lot is a shadow picture of the flesh, while Abraham's a shadow picture of a man who's walking in the spirit, willing to have the dead flesh cut off. When's the last time you kicked Lot out of your house? Well, it got quiet. Well, wait a minute, I don't know who Lot is. You lie. You know who Lot is. You know who's been rising, whose flesh been rising up. You go and look at it in the mirror. Go look at Lot in the mirror. Lot's the one's been giving you trouble. I told people years ago, I'm not afraid of the devil. I am not afraid of Satan. I'm afraid of the devil I look at in the mirror. That's the one. That's the Lot. That's the fleshly man. That's the one, Abraham, the one that walks in the Spirit. That's the one that's going to cross over. That's the one that's ready to rise to the challenge. That's the one he wants to get away from him. Because the moment you feel ready to rise to the challenge, he's going to come up with every excuse possible to keep you from doing it. I'm talking about this fleshly man. Say amen. Are you with me? Now, I thought it was interesting because that fleshly carnal man, he's the one that relocates right there where my inheritance is. Can you imagine? If I'd have been Abraham, I'd have been peeved. I'll be honest with you. That's my inheritance. And this nephew of mine, in the flesh, that's sent to just torment me, gonna come over here and get right up in the middle and camp out in my inheritance? Are y'all hearing me? He's the flesh of Abraham. And if you go back and read it, she talked about it last week. He said that Lot and Lot's herdsmen, they gendered strife. The word strife there is the word reeve. Say that with me, reeve. And it means strife, but it also indicates to litigate a lawsuit. Why? Dead flesh reproduces after its kind. The herdsmen of Lot, they're the ones that were given to strife and envy and jealousy and hatred and bitterness and backbiting and sowing seeds of discord and death and confusion and consternation and always causing problems. While the herdmen of Abraham, I believe, walked after the Spirit, and I believe that they had joy and peace and long suffering and patience and gentleness and kindness, and they were excited and they were wanting to do something for Yahweh. And these fleshly, carnal individuals, all they want to do is come and camp out right there where my inheritance is supposed to be. And I just tolerate them because they kin folks. This flesh has been with me for a long time, and so I'm willing to overlook some of the things this flesh is prone to do, and I'll be honest with you. But I dare say this much, I'm not going to tolerate it in you. Hello? I'm serious. That's human nature. And that's what Yahweh is trying to expose in us. And I want you to remember something. Proverbs 18:21 says, death and life both are in the power of the tongue. You can have Abraham coming out of your mouth, or you can have the words of Lot coming out of your mouth. That's my inheritance. Come on over here, guys. We're going to circumcise this whole bunch. Can you imagine if we got up enough, a few men with a little backbone, and we sharpened our knives and we decided we're going to go throughout the city of Salem and we're going to circumcise a bunch of folks? Y'all hear me? Abraham did this. Now, we can laugh about it if you want, but the problem is that we don't have enough backbone to circumcise our household. So we need to forget about Salem. The tongue's got to be circumcised. The tongue, like the male member, penetrates the veil of the flesh in order to release seed. The tongue penetrates the veil of the flesh, and it can produce light or darkness. That's why it's got to be circumcised. The root of that word reeb, the reshbeh, means to be increased, to be great or many, but it also conveys the idea that if I'm going to have strife with you, it conveys this idea of me seizing you by the head and I'm going to deal with you personally. I thought, oh my goodness, reminds me of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, when it said that the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman would be in strife one with another. The spirit and the flesh, Abraham and Lot, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Yeshua and Barabbas, you and your flesh. And it says that one would attempt to bruise the head, seize you by the hair, and tell you, this is how you're going to do things. And while you're attempting to bruise its heel. You see that? Hello? It's a demonstration of Genesis 3:15. That word bruising, shuf, is important because Yahweh's trying to teach you something. The enemy's not playing games with you. And once again, right there in Genesis chapter 3, just like we saw in Genesis chapter 9, I believe that adultery and sodomy occurred at the same time. And so the struggle that began in the Garden of Eden, you see it being lived out once more here with Lot's herdsmen and Abraham, because they attempt to seize the head of Abraham, the symbol of his inheritance. Yet Abraham himself, listen to me, Abraham really doesn't have a right to the land by inheritance because Abraham is a fleshly man that has just learned how to deal with his flesh. Abraham's an observer of the covenant. And so the one that has the title deed to the land has to show up in order for Sodom and Gomorrah to not have a legal leg to stand on. See, Abraham couldn't legally go in there and take the land because Abraham was just an observer. The one that had the title deed was the one that showed up and said, okay, Abraham, I'm going to displace the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. Who's going to fight your battle for you? I wonder What was so unique about the land of Canaan? You think maybe since we were looking at Genesis chapter 3 and that first struggle there, do you think maybe there's a connection with the land of Canaan and the land of Eden? Have you ever asked yourself that? In Genesis chapter 13, verse 10, Lot describes Canaan as the garden of Yahweh. And so you see a shadow picture here of Lot, the first Adam who was in the flesh, the man of the flesh. And after the blood's applied, he becomes a shadow picture of the Messiah who's able to redeem. Abraham becomes a shadow picture of the Messiah who is able to redeem. Brenda brought up an interesting thing. Abraham actually is instrumental in redeeming Lot on 2 different occasions. Once he was taken captive by the kings. Abraham goes in and deals with him. And the second time he's down in Sodom. I think he had a pretty untoward track record, in my opinion. I believe that he was probably a congregational leader in the Hebrew roots community. Hallelujah. I've been called to go down into Sodom and preach. Well, you know, the New Testament describes Lot as the righteous man. I don't think so. And I want to ask you a question. Is it possible that the land has to be redeemed just like man has to be redeemed? The promise of return to the land cannot be separated from the redemption plan of Yahweh. We saw that in Romans chapter 8, verse 17 through 23. And the only way that you can see your bodily redemption is because through the plan of Yahweh. And the same thing with the land. The land has to be set free. So why were Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed? By the way, did you know that the same lamp that walks between the pieces in Genesis chapter 15 when Abraham offers a sacrifice is about to walk through between the pieces at Sodom and Gomorrah? Think about that one. I've got some more notes, but we'll skip over. So the simple response in view of the study we've looked at as far as that the reason Sodom and Gomorrah is being destroyed is because they're occupying the land of Abraham's inheritance. But is that true? If you look throughout the Tanakh, there's 5 major passages where a divine injunction is issued against anyone who would move or shift ancient boundaries, land or otherwise. By the way, the 10 Commandments are ancient boundaries. These boundaries would have also included sexual impropriety, the boundaries that are established in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. And it would have also included the commingling of the heavenly and the earthly bodies that you see in Genesis chapter 3 and Genesis chapter 6 that required the earth to be destroyed by a flood. And you see that Sodom crosses these boundaries of adultery and sodomy just like Adam did, just like Noah's son Ham did. And you see that because of that, the land that was promised to the seed of the woman, again, Abraham was an heir not by right but by covenant. That's why sometimes our Jewish brothers get upset with us because they insist that they are heirs by right. No, you're an heir by covenant, and you can't forget that, Yehudah. In Genesis chapter 15, 16, Yahweh tells Abraham that he will not be able to occupy the land until the iniquity of the Amorites is full. And the Amorites were one of those 7 Canaanite nations. How long have I been going? Does anybody know? Can y'all hold on for a little while? 1 minute? 1 hour? Can y'all hold on for a minute? You tired? We can quit. Y'all can leave if you want to, but I'm going to finish it. Let's look at this for a second. In order to deal with Sodom and Gomorrah, something else has to take place. Just like with Adam, the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah crossed boundaries in order to propagate the seed line of the serpent and his claim to Eden. This place was called Canaan, but it was also the land of Eden. The title deed belonged to the seed of the woman. Are you listening to me? And the enemy had set up shop, set up house in that land and was claiming the title deed to that land and had usurped the authority to occupy the land. There are some of you that have an inheritance promised by Yahweh, but the enemy's occupying your inheritance and he's eating up the harvest that belongs to you. Okay? Genesis chapter 14 and chapter 15 refer to these inhabitants as Rephaim, the dead ones. Go figure that. The word Raphaim can mean health, invigorate, to sew something together, to mend. In other words, to bring immortality to the flesh by sewing or mixing death and life. Satan misunderstood the purpose of Messiah having to die. Look at it this way. Satan felt like he could commingle his seed with the seed of man or the seed of the woman and create something immortal. But because of sin, the fleshly body has to die. And so when Yeshua comes along, Yeshua's the serpent, is the seed of Yahweh, and the seed of Yahweh is going to commingle with the seed of woman, and the natural thing for the serpent to think is that, yeah, he's going to die. And he does die. He kills him, but because there's no sin in him, he lives, and therefore it throws the camp of the enemy into confusion. And so if you understand that if the flesh has no sin in it, which Yeshua didn't, then death can't hold you. But as long as you walk in the flesh that has sin in it, death rules, and death has to be cut off. So you just cannot cross those boundaries. You cannot walk in the spirit and walk in the flesh at the same time. If you do, you're moving the ancient boundaries. Are you listening to me? But because of that, the unlawful inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah have laid claim to Eden, Canaan. They were not Adamic. They didn't come out of the loins of the woman. Even though they had the patriarch Noah, Ham, and Canaan in common with Lot. And so you can go back and read it. You can see my notes here and you can get them. But I'm telling you, they had created a species thinking that they could usurp the inheritance of Yahweh and the redemption plan of Yahweh. And Yahweh has to come down and investigate their legal claim. Yahweh has been telling you for generations, come and let us plead together. Declare thou that thou mayest be justified. Yahweh is moved by a legal contract. The word plead there means to litigate. If you have a cause against Yahweh, if you feel like that you're being unduly persecuted, if you're thinking that you're going through a situation or trouble in your life that's just you don't deserve it, then you have a right to go and litigate that with Yahweh. Are you hearing me? On the other hand, if the enemy is coming against you and you understand that he has no right, he has no legal access into your life because you've been covered by the blood of the Lamb, you are a redeemed man, you're walking in the word of Yahweh and you're speaking the word of Yahweh into your situation, the enemy does not have the ability to litigate a cause and win that against you. And so here the children of the seed of the woman, Abraham, is standing here watching the enemy occupy what's his inheritance, and the enemy's laid claim to it. And so now Abraham, because Abraham has been calling out to Yahweh, Yahweh shows up on the scene in the person of Yeshua in order to litigate the claim in the courtroom of creation. Are you listening to me? Something's about to happen. If you go back and look at the word cry, when Yeshua says, I don't need to hide this stuff from Abraham. And so he tells Abraham what he's going to do. And it says, Abraham, the cry of Sodom is ascended to me, and I've come down to see if it's so. And it sounds as if Yahweh, he's omnipotent and he's omnipresent. You think that he couldn't have dealt with it in heaven? If he heard their cry? No, it's a legal term. That word for cry there is a term in the Hebrew that means that they have summoned him on the scene. They had declared, this is our inheritance. We're laying claim to it. It's ours. If you're going to do anything about it, you're going to have to show up and litigate it. And so he does. He steps on the scene. And the enemy will do that in your life. He'll tell you, I've got a legal claim in your life, where it's a generational curse or not. That legal claim might be there. There may be drugs and alcohol, divorce, all kinds of strife and confusion in your life that may have been there from generations. And if you've done everything you can to break that and you plead the blood, litigate the blood of Messiah in your life, he has no legal grounds. And so you can summon Yahweh on the scene, and he comes in and will move the inhabitants that are there illegally. Oh, my goodness. My goodness. Let's go on down a little bit further. The rightful owner shows up throughout Torah. Property is acquired by purchase or inheritance. And if you go back and look at it, Abraham had never purchased this piece of property. The only piece of property Abraham's recorded as having purchased was the cave of Machpelah, where he buries his wife. But there's yet a hidden cost involved in the acquisition of Canaan, and you're going to see it. It required Abraham to circumcise himself to cut off his flesh. Are you with me? Genesis 17:11, you'll circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. Go back and look at that. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt you and me. You read that? Have you ever looked at it in the Hebrew language? It looks as if we're talking to Abraham. Abraham, you're going to circumcise the foreskin of your flesh. In the Hebrew language, Abraham's not the one being spoken to. Abraham's sitting back, and Abraham's watching the individual that Yahweh's speaking to. In the Hebrew language there, it says, Une maltem et basar. And the Aleph and Tav, which is a reference to the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the everlasting one, the one who was and is to come. He's the one that's going to be circumcised in the flesh, and he's the one that shows up to lay claim to the land of Canaan and to judge the iniquity of those who've moved the boundary stones. Abraham sees what the Messiah's doing, and Abraham says, if he did it, oh my goodness, I want to be a part of it. And so Abraham follows suit and circumcises himself so that he can be an observer of the covenant of Yahweh. If Yahweh says it can be done, if Yeshua has done it, Yahweh has declared that there's nothing that Yeshua's done that we can't do if we walk in the flesh. In fact, if we walk in the Spirit. In fact, Yeshua said, greater works than these shall you do. Why? Because I'm going to my Father. You see how important this is? Not only does Messiah announce the heir of Abraham that's going to be born a year later right here. Now this is interesting. I want you to pay attention because he shows up to tell Abraham, Abraham, you and Sarah are going to have a baby a year from now, and it's going to be born at Passover a year from this date, right? And so the enemy listens. The enemy listens when the enemy speaks to you. Don't say that. But he can't read your mind, so he has to watch how you act in order to respond. Does that make sense to you? And so the way that the enemy plans his next move against you is he watches your composure. He watches your face. He watches your attitude. And so if the enemy says something to you that's terrifying, fearful, frustrating, it makes you angry, to get you upset, and he watches your facial expressions and your body language, and he knows how to plan his next move. You see? And so what you find happening here is when the enemy begins to speak to Abraham or speak to Yeshua, and we understand that we can speak the word of Yahweh in that particular situation and see things change without fear of the enemy, then change is going to take place. And so if the enemy is speaking something contrary to the word of Yahweh, he does not have a legal right. And so Yahweh will cause the one that is the seed to show up. Now think about this. Yahweh promised Abraham and Sarah that the seed, which is a shadow picture of Yeshua, is going to show up a year from, right? And the interesting thing, the very next sexual demonstration you see is that those men of Sodom attempt to have their way with the two daughters of Lot, trying to compromise the seed line again. You see how the enemy works? If the enemy can gain inroads into your flesh, he will, and he does that. Guess what? He doesn't force you either. Isn't that interesting? He can't force you, but he does so by invitation. I'm trying to skip down so I can cover some of that. Abraham knows the future of Lot, the flesh. And he also understands that the future sons of Adam, those that were the generations who were to subdue and have dominion, depend on what's about to happen next. And so I want to look at the word Sodom. I've got about 10 more, 12 more slides. Can y'all hold on? You can leave if you want to. The word Sodom is translated burning. The root dalet, samek, the root, Samic Dalet can't be found in linguistics. However, the Shin Dalet root forms the root of words that mean devil, demons, violence, destruction, to receive a sacrifice to Satan. It's connected with seeding the ground, a field, the domain, or the land. And so what you find here is that they're attempting, these enemies of Yahweh are attempting to seed the field, the Garden of Eden, with the seed of the serpent, just like what happened in Genesis chapter 3. The numeric value of Sodom is 105. It's the same as Strong's number 5930, the word olah, which is a whole burnt offering that requires the flesh to be totally consumed. It can indicate elah, a technical legal term for an allegation or an accusation. It's the root of the word milah, to circumcise. Now you know why there had to be some fire and brimstone, because the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah got up in the face of the Creator. And they began to make accusations, assuming that they had a legal right to make accusations in the face of the Creator. And they have the audacity to infer that their God's bigger than what the God of Abraham is. And so they're offering themselves up as an olah, a whole burnt offering to their God. And so Yahweh shows up. Okay, we're going to call fire down. And whatever's left, that's the ones that would be the seed of this woman. And so when fire falls on Sodom and Gomorrah, it kind of eliminates the legal argument, doesn't it? You see how it pays to understand how important it is to follow the word of Yahweh. Look at the word Gomorrah. It's from the word Amra, which means to bind something, like sheaves, to subdue it, to have the feminine capacity to receive seed. Gomorrah has a numeric value of 315, the same as Arema, which is the same root of Joseph of Arimathea. Sodom and Gomorrah was a place of violent destruction that required that one must be lifted up. The inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah thought that they could deliver themselves and redeem themselves, and so Yahweh just gave them what they thought they could have. He allowed them to be lifted up and be consumed. Let me share this with you. There's a fire that's coming, and that fire is going to burn up the wood, hay, and stubble in your life. And what's going to be left is going to be the seed of the woman. Are you with me? Let's look a little bit further. The land's inhabitants bound up words of destructive, violent origin as an offering to Satan in order to seed the ground. These are the same folks that were mentioned to Abraham, whose iniquity had to be fulfilled 400 years later. And so the timing of Messiah's visit was very apropos. It came on the announcement of the seed of the woman that was going to be birthed, Isaac, and then all of a sudden the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I found it interesting because the same thing happens in Exodus when the children of Israel are about to be delivered from Egypt. Pharaoh stands in opposition as his great house, the seed against the seed of Yahweh, and he gets cut off. Do y'all see that? Look a little bit further. I want to look at the word iniquity. The iniquity of the Amorites, one of the Canaanite nations. It comes from a generic form, ayin vav, which hints at distortion, to witness, to testify, to repeat, to continue, to twist, to bend something, to act in ruin, to act wrongfully, to deviate from a moral standard. It indicates to compromise the conjugal rights of the woman. And so you see that it was to destroy the seed of the woman. And so the enemy has usurped the inheritance of Adam and Abraham, and it requires the lamb to be circumcised in order to restore man and creation. In Genesis 19:29, Yahweh says that he's going to overthrow Sodom and Gomorrah. The word for overthrow is chafak. It means to change, to transform it, to turn it back or turn it aside. It's the same term used regarding the sword that was at the entrance to Eden, that stood there to repel all of those that would try and have access to the tree of life in an untoward manner. And it's interesting because the numeric value of chafak is 105. It's the same as the word for Sodom. It's the same as the word for olah, as an olah offering. And then Yahweh says, I'm going to rain upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire out of heaven. The word for brimstone is gofrit. and it's translated as sulfur, but it comes from the Hebrew word gopher, which is a word that's used in Genesis chapter 6 to describe the ark's construction. It was made from this same type of wood, gopher, meaning a pitch or resin. It was a word that means to cover, to perpetuate. It means to atone, to ransom, to redeem. Genesis chapter 6 was also an Exodus. The wicked flesh are cut off and the righteous are redeemed. And by the way, that lamp that went between the pieces when Abraham offered a sacrifice is the lamp that is seen in the manifestation of fire and brimstone walking between Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot and Abraham. And that same lamp is seen in Genesis chapter 6 when Yahweh tells Noah how to construct the ark. You remember when he says, Noah, build a window? The ark becomes a symbol of the seed of the woman who has to be saved from the destruction that's outside. And so that window is between the outside and the inhabitants in the ark, right? The word for window there is the word zohar, and it means a lamp. It means a torch. It means a blazing, brilliant light. And so again, right there in the ark is this burning lamp that walks between the pieces, protecting the inhabitants of Yahweh, protecting the people of Yahweh, protecting those that walk in covenant with Him. Amen? And you know what the word ish means, a word for fire, fire and brimstone. It was the man of fire, the lamp that passed between the pieces. Yeshua was here to walk between the pieces of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in Exodus chapter 12, verse 8, when you eat the Passover lamb, it has to be wholly burnt by fire. So the lamb in the person of that burning lamp walks there between the pieces to keep the seed of the woman from commingling with the seed of the flesh. Can you see that? That's why it's important for us to watch what's being shown us in these Torah portions. I want to finish with this real quickly. You remember when there's a discussion with Abraham and Lot, and Abraham and Yahweh, and Abraham seems to be interceding on behalf of the inhabitants. And he said, if there's 50, will you save them? If there's 45, 40, 30, 20, 10, right? Why did Abraham choose those numbers? Was it just arbitrarily? Abraham knew who was in Sodom and Gomorrah. He knew who was righteous and who wasn't. If you look at the numeric value of all of those numbers, it's 195. It's the same as the word miknah, which means to purchase a possession at a specific price. If you were to look at 50, it's noon, 45, and 40, 30, 20, 10, and write it out, it spells the word Nima Malki. And it literally indicates something that's contemptible, something that's loathed, despised, and abhorred, something that's rash, violent, and impetuous before Malki, my king. And so he's reminding, in my opinion, what needs to take place there in that group of individuals that have exalted themselves against the king of creation. And he understands he's interceding, I also believe, for his son, or his nephew Lot. 50 represents noon, life, jubilee, liberty, to be set free. 45 represents the Adam. 40 represents Mem, the womb, the Exodus, the flesh that's cut off. 30 represents the Lamed, to teach, to urge towards the Torah. 20 is the Kaf, the palm, the sole of the foot, the title deed. Yod represents the hand, the power, the strength of Yahweh, the seed. What we're being told here is that Abraham's bargaining on behalf of the son of Noon, 50, life. The second Adam, 45, born from the womb, 40 of the Torah, 30, who would restore the title deed, 20, by the hand, 10 of Yahweh to his seed. You see why the Messiah showed up to deal with the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah? You see why the flesh has to be cut off? The flesh has to be dealt with. I'm telling you, fire and brimstone's coming. The lamb that was slain will cover you, but there's a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that will walk between the pieces. Can you stand the fire? Shabbat shalom.